Okay, let's move on. So I had some emails asking me also about the exam again. So it's really two separate exams. Right? If you take entrepreneurial finance, that's a 3-hour exam, which might be on a different day than the 3-hour exam that you take if you're taking business finance. Okay, two separate exams, potentially on separate days. One where the content is 100% the material of the first 6 weeks, and one where the material is material from the first from all of the 12 weeks, roughly 50-50, but of course with some variation. Okay. The other thing, I also had some questions about this. The book, I think is very useful for the first part, so I really would strongly recommend it. It's very thick, and so we're covering a lot of material in terms of topics. And to fit this into the 6 weeks, I don't always have time to kind of have too many examples or really talk through different cases, especially if we also want to incorporate the guest speakers a bit. So what I think is nice in the example in the book, for example, is that it takes a case and basically uses that case through the different chapters, so you really see how some of the things that I present to you here are applied in a real-world case, and which considerations arise that I may not be able to, that I maybe mention, but that kind of get a bit ignored if you don't follow up with the reading. There are also exercises, especially kind of these reflection questions, which I think are very useful for, I don't always. Okay. The other thing, I also had some questions about this. The book, I think is very useful for the first part, so I really would strongly recommend it. It's very thick, and so we're covering a lot of material in terms of topics. And to fit this into the 6 weeks, I don't always have time to kind of have too many examples or really talk through different cases, especially if we also want to incorporate the guest speakers a bit. So what I think is nice in the example in the book, for example, is that it takes a case and basically uses that case through the different chapters, so you really see how some of the things that I present to you here are applied in a real-world case, and which considerations arise that I may not be able to, that I maybe mention, but that kind of get a bit ignored if you don't follow up with the reading. There are also exercises, especially kind of these reflection questions, which I think are very useful to prepare for the exam. Right? So like I said, there's a part multiple choice, and so it's just a good test to try to think about the questions in the book. In addition to this, I have uploaded, and I will occasionally upload a few additional questions on Toledo. So I put something on in the folder for last week also that hopefully illustrates this idea of adverse selection a bit more. Put something in today that hopefully illustrates the idea of dilution a bit more. But I will not do this for every week, so I will do this if I think it makes sense. And and again, so for the more open-ended questions, it's really useful if we have a bit of discussion. So if one of you or two of you have a look at this evaluation matrix, apply them to real-world cases, or try to look at the projections that are presented on, like, for companies, maybe on crowdfunding websites, and you want to question them and discuss them, that I think that could be useful. So if someone has an interest there, I'm happy to incorporate this too. Okay, good. So this being said, the next thing I want to talk about are ownership and returns. And I mentioned in the projections part that this is a tool that also helps you in negotiations, right? So financial projections. And a big part of the negotiations are, of course, kind of first receiving funding, but within the discussion about receiving funding, ownership is a very important thing that needs to be decided. And having more kind of well-founded predictions about your finances, your financial needs, and ultimately the value of your company will be very helpful there. Okay, so let's try to discuss a bit what that actually means. So what I want you to understand today is first the relationship between the amount that gets invested and the ownership shares, how valuation and dilution are related to this. So there's a separate chapter on valuations, but I think the foundations we kind of more or less have, so we might go a bit faster there. Derive the allocation of shares and the post and pre-money valuation over different rounds, right? So keep track of this. Understand the type of return measures that different investors might be operating with and what they mean and what they capture and what is potentially missing in them. Right? And then the part that's a bit, so it's a smaller part, but crucial in the process, of course, is also the decision of how to allocate ownership shares among the founders. So not even thinking about external finance providers coming in, but within the founding team, how do you then best allocate the shares? Okay. So what are these ownership shares? Right, so just at a very broad level, I said equity funding is a particularly plausible financing tool instrument for entrepreneurial ventures because it doesn't have these kind of committed interest payments. Right? But ownership is related. I mean, equity funding is related to ownership. Right? So owning equity in a company means you own a certain fraction of that company. Okay, and determining those and in relation to this valuing the company is important in structuring any type of investment and is particularly relevant here. Right? So how you value a company has these two important implications. Of course, it's important for the returns. And if you're selling part of your company, it's important how a potential buyer values this because that's the money you get back from this. But it also determines how much ownership of the company you give up. Right? So depending on how, right? So you want a certain amount of money from an investor. He wants a fraction of your company in return, wants to be owner in a fraction of your company in return. And then depending on how valuable this company he thinks is, the fraction that he wants is smaller or larger. Right? So how much you have to give up in terms of ownership is directly related to how the company is valued. Right? Okay. So for this part, we're not caring so much about where this valuation comes from. That's in the next chapter. So we think about this implied valuation, which is basically reflecting how a potential investor values your company. Right? So the investment will be the fraction of the ownership times the valuation. Right? So the investor provides 1 million to the company. If he thinks the company is worth 10 million, right, then he wants 10% of the company in return, at least. Okay? If he thinks the company is more valuable, right, if it's worth only 5 million, he might want 20% of an ownership stake. Okay? So once the deal is made and the ownership company should be, you might be able to be in a stronger position to negotiate on this. Right? So you might be in a position to give up less or convince the investor that he's happy with a smaller fraction of ownership in your company. Okay. In terms of with the mechanics and terminology, right? So we think of post-money valuation is the pre-money valuation plus the investment. Right? The value of the company before the investment was made, that's the pre-money valuation. So again, it's intuitive, but it's important to have this terminology in mind. Right? So in terms of notation, it's exactly what I said before. Right? The implied valuation is a post-money valuation because the investor owns part of the company after he made his investment. Right? So this is the size of the investment, and this F is the ownership share that he gets in return. And then the pre-money valuation would be the post-money valuation minus the size of the investment. Okay? So typically ownership is allocated in terms of shares. Right? So how many shares does the investor buy? And in the first round, this is really arbitrary. Right? There's no market for this, and it's a question is how much shares are there? That's undefined. Right? So that means also it's undefined how many shares account for 20% ownership. But you need to fix the number of shares at this point. So it's purely a scaling factor, but one that needs to be decided at the first financing round. Okay, and then afterwards, once the total number is kind of set, then you define the number of shares that are outstanding after the investment as the one that was existing before, plus the new shares that you're giving out. Okay. Again, this is the investment, right? So the investment is then the price of the share times the shares the investor is buying. The valuation, the post-money valuation, is then the total number of shares, including those of the investor, times the price of the share at this point. And the pre-money valuation is, of course, the shares without the investor's money, so without the additional shares and the price. And the ownership shares is simply the ratio between the total number of shares and the number of shares of the different parties. Right? For example, all of the F-pre would be the ownership fraction that everyone who was an owner of the company before the investment, how much they jointly hold, and this one would be the fraction that the investor gets through the investment. Okay. We also already indicated that stock options are typically an important part of the compensation package for staff or personnel at a venture. Right? Again, because it reduces compensation in terms of cash, which is often a limited resource for companies. And so you defer these cash payments, but you still want to be able to hire kind of capable staff. So you give them stock options, whereby they're basically compensated then at the exit through ownership. Okay, so you typically, for this purpose, initially set aside what is called the stock options pool. Right, so you already set aside a number of shares that is dedicated to be future compensation of potential hires that you make. Okay, and this is just to be aware of, because it maybe then is a more realistic reflection of your ownership as a founder in the beginning. Yes, there's a question. Yeah.
How would you go about choosing how many shares you would issue in the first round? Is it just a random number, or companies take millions, some take, I don't know, 12?
I think in this space it really doesn't. It's really arbitrary, right? So it's an accounting unit. If you think about more much later, right? If you have mature companies that are listed on the stock market, what they sometimes do is what's called a stock split. Where you basically say what used to be one share is now two shares. So everyone who held one share now has two shares. And sometimes what you see is then that the price of these two shares is not exactly half of the original price. Right? So there is a value effect of doing this. Where exactly that effect comes from is not so clear. Right? It could be that people are more likely to buy shares if they have a lower price and are reluctant to buy a share that in itself costs maybe $1,000. Right, so but this is really a behavioral effect that shouldn't be the case. So, yeah, don't make it too granular. There's no reason of taking stock of millions of shares. Right, have a plausible number, and the other factor that might play a role is the price per share. But I think that's more an issue for kind of publicly traded shares. Right, so, where you have smaller investors who might be put off by very high per stock share prices, and they might be more willing to buy shares that are smaller price. But